Hi everyone, my name is Sophie Hunter, and I'm a fellow in the Art Conservation Lab at the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe. Today, I'm going to be going over some techniques of materials and actual techniques for making storage mounts and storage solutions for a huge, broad range of artifacts that you might have in your collection. So before I got into art conservation, I spent many years working in a lot of different museums just doing rehousing. So all I was doing was making storage mounts, making boxes for entire collections. So I did most of my experience at the Southwest Museum of the American Indian, which is now the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. I've also worked at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. I did a lot of rehousing for the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and also the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences, and then a couple other smaller places. So, and of course in Santa Fe at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the Folk Art and the New Mexico History Museum. So I've worked with a really broad range of items from different kinds of collections. And today these are just the things the techniques that I've used just over and over and over again that are just so useful. Just a really quick note about storage materials. So right here I've listed the materials that I use most often when I'm making storage mounts. And so we use these materials because they've been tested and they're proven to be long-lasting or archival, and they don't off-gas any kind of harmful chemicals that might affect your collection in a negative way. Now, using these materials can be very, very expensive for museums. So, we do the best that we can with the materials that we have and the resources that we have, and we're always trying to aim for the ideal. So how do we know that these materials are okay to use? Well, most of those materials have been tested before for their archival qualities. So one of the most popular tests used by conservators is the Audi test. And that consists of taking a little piece of a material and put it into a glass jar that's sealed, along with a polished silver and copper and lead coupon. And then that's put in an oven for a few weeks. And when you take it out, you see if your silver coupon comes out and it's still really nice and bright and shiny, then chances are that that material is probably going to be okay for your collection long term. But if it comes out and your silver coupon is all black and tarnished and your copper coupon has all this green corrosion on it, then chances are that that material might not be good for your collection. It might make your silver objects start to tarnish, things like that. So if you see an object in this presentation, if you have a material you want to use but you don't see it in this presentation, a lot of institutions publish their Audi test results online. So like the British Museum does, so does the Getty Center in California. So you could try to do a quick Google search of your material and then in quotation marks just put Audi test, and you might be able to find results, or you can email me and I can try to tell you if I can find them. There are other tests too people do, like accelerated aging tests. A sodium azide test is a really popular one that tests for sulfur, and then fancy instrumentation like GCMS. So why is it important to use archival materials? Because we see the effects of not using them. So for instance, here's an example of a nice little print where a mat was on it. It was probably just bought in the store. So it was an acidic paper as opposed to a non-acidic archival paper. And you can see the mat burn that happened. Or we're all really familiar with bubble wrap. Bubble wrap's really popular. So bubble wrap, when it comes into contact with heat, it starts leaching these sticky plasticizers that can stick to our objects. So that damage, this wooden piece, I've actually taken out ceramics from boxes before that were wrapped in bubble wrap, and the pots had like a perfect polka dot pattern on them because the plasticizers leached out and the pot just seeped up that plastic, and so it's like permanently stained. And then there's this really popular gray foam that's usually polyurethane foam, and polyurethane with heat and light will break down and become really brittle and sticky and can stick to our objects and damage them too. So that's why we strive to use materials where we know that they're going to last a long time and they're not going to degrade in our collection. First, I'm just going to go through basic process of making pallets, trays, wedges, and boxes. And these are things that I use literally every single time I make a storage mount. And then I'll go into some more specialty mounts, like a great mount for ceramics or pots and storage, arrows, hats and headdresses, standing figurines. And I don't think I'm going to get to shards and textiles today, but I have the slides here. If we have lunch afterwards, so if anyone wants to review more things, come up afterwards. I can go over stuff, or also you can take my email down. I had it on the first slide, but I can give you my email after for anyone who came in later. Just a little vocab. When I say pallet or tray, I just mean the thing that you use to take the object from one place to another. It's just the thing the object sits on. Wedges or padding are the thing that we put on the pallet or in the tray that keeps that object immobile, keeps it from moving. And then a box is a box, of course, used for transfer. But boxes are also really good in storage because it protects your item from dust and it protects it from light if you have light in your storage area. So the pallets. I like to put everything I possibly can onto a pallet because the pallet is awesome. It allows, and just like, let's just pretend this is our pallet right here, right? If your object is mounted on a pallet, that allows you to take that object from your shelf onto a table. You can rotate that object to view it. You can put it in a box, and you never have to touch the actual object. And that's really important in museum storage because actually the most damage that happens to objects happens from handling them in the storage area or for exhibition, for instance. So pallets are really great. And the material you use for a pallet will depend on the size and the weight of your object. So for instance, here's some Archival blue board, just single ply blue board. You guys can pass this stuff around. That blue board also comes double ply. I'm saying blue board, that's just kind of like common word, but it's just corrugated Archival board. So that's a little sturdier for like a little bit heavier objects. So like for instance, this is some of Harriet Tubman's silverware, and I just mounted that on just a single ply blue board. This is a material called Coroplast, or that's the brand name, and this is a polypropylene corrugated board. And this Coroplast comes in the thin version, but it also comes in a 1/4-inch version and this 10 millimeter size. This 10 millimeter size is really awesome because it is super rigid. So you can use this for pallets and boxes actually for like really heavy pots or really heavy items. So you can see that's a typewriter. I don't know if anyone's even seen a typewriter anymore, but they're pretty heavy things. So I use the 10 millimeter Coroplast for that typewriter, and it works just fine. For things that are where you need something even more than the 10 millimeter Coroplast, there is a material called Sintra. And Sintra, you work it like wood, so you have to use a bandsaw to cut it and stuff, but it's heavy duty, so it's worth it if you have a really heavy item. And if you can't get a hold of Sintra, but you still need something more heavy duty, you can technically use wood, although it's not ideal. Wood off-gases in your collection, so you don't want off-gassing wood with your objects. However, there's a material that's a shiny silver material called Marvel Seal. And it's like the same stuff that's inside of a Pringle can or in a chip bag that keeps the air inside all contained and keeps your chips fresh. So what you do is you get a roll of Marvel Seal and then you iron it onto the wood throughout with no cracks. And that pretty much contains all those harmful chemicals in the wood that might off-gas into your collection. So if you need to use wood for something really heavy duty, you can. You just need some Marvel Seal. Or you can just double up that 10 millimeter Coroplast with some glue. So some notes about pallets. Pallets, it's a really good idea when you have a pallet to cut off the corners, make tabs on your pallets. And that's really good because when all of your pallets are up against each other in the storage, that little tab just allows you an area to put your fingers in. It's easier to handle them, it's easier to put it in boxes, and etc. Also, when we're mounting an object on a pallet, it's really tempting to make our pallet a lot bigger than the object because it's really pretty. You know, it looks like a frame or something in a picture. But we all know that space in museum storage is like non-existent or extremely limited. So we want to make our pallets as small as safely possible. And really all you need is 1/2 inch between the edge of your object and the edge of the pallet. And that may seem like such a small space, but the truth is when all your pallets are together, if there's a 1/2 inch between each object and then the pallet, then there's going to be at least 1 whole inch between the edge of each object. And that's perfectly safe and fine. Those objects aren't going to be knocking into each other. So I always leave 1/2 inch to 1 inch on each side of my object. So here's a picture of a bunch of ceramics. They're mounted using that technique with the 1/2 inch between the edge of the pallet and the edge of the object. And you can see when they're lined up, there's plenty of space between each ceramic. They're all totally safe. And here's that tab cut off. It just allows for much easier handling. We want to make it as easy as possible and as intuitive as possible for the handler to pick up this object. So the worst thing that we can do making storage mounts is to make something where you need to leave a ton of notes for somebody to tell them how to use it. Here's an example of a really heavy-duty pallet I made where I glued 2 pieces of the 10mm coroplast together. And you can see that I'm making the top layer larger than the bottom layer because then it'll be much easier for someone to put their fingers underneath. So that's just like a little example of always thinking about trying to make it easier for somebody. So trays are kind of like pallets, except they have edges, they have sides. And you can mount something directly inside of a tray. Trays are really good for things that have like components that might fall off. Like basically anything that I mount that has beads on it, I put it in a tray because we all know beads will come off sometimes. And then if they're in that tray, it'll catch the bead. Or like baskets that have like resin all around them, the water baskets, that resin can get dry and start flaking off. So if that basket is mounted on a pallet and then the pallet's inside of a tray, that tray will catch all that resin as it starts to fall off. They're also really good for stacking and for flat objects. So just to give an example, this was a ceramic that was broken and in a box, so all the pieces were kind of hitting up against each other. It was getting damaged, so I took each piece out and put them, each single shard in its own tray. And that way it allowed them to be put in a box together but without banging against each other. And then I made the tray walls high enough so that they could then be stacked in a box together. Here's an example of some leggings in a tray. And these are pipe bags that were mounted on pallets with ethafoam. However, there's no reason that those pipe bags couldn't have just been mounted in trays. A tray, it's pretty easy. What you do is you just measure the length and the width of your object, and then you add just about 1/2 inch to 1 inch on each side. Then you figure out how tall you want your walls to be. Now, let's say we have like a beaded necklace, right? That's really, really short. It's not tall at all. So our instinct is to make the tray walls just maybe like 1 inch high, right? But the problem with that is that if your tray walls are only 1 inch high, then your tray is going to be really, really weak. It's not going to be strong. So even if it's just a beaded necklace, I always make my trays with at least 2 inch high walls. And that's also the same for my box lids. I always make everything at least 2 inches high. So we measure our object, calculate for 2 inches on each side, and then you cut your tabs because we're going to glue this tray together. Now this board has a grain to it. So in this case it goes this way. If you cut your tab with the grain, then that actually makes a stronger tray. Because if I'll show you an example. So, well, first you can mark it out with pencil if you want to. And then I like using a Sharpie to kind of just indent, just write down where I've scored it with the blade. So I indent it like this. Actually, I think I have steps. Yeah, like that. And then I cut it along the tabs, along the grain, with the grain. So I cut it with the grain. So now when I bend these tabs to glue, this is going against the grain. And that makes for a much stronger tray than if you're bending it with the grain. Because if you bend it with the grain, then it can tear really easily. So, and then you just glue them. So now, I forgot to mention in the beginning that all this stuff I'm talking about today, it's not like the only way to do it. There's no one way or one right way to do it. Like you might have another way or know somebody who has another way to make a tray or a box or a mount, for instance. And just because I don't show that way here today doesn't mean that they're wrong or that I'm right or that I'm wrong and they're right or anything like that. These are just some tactics that I find useful, and you're going to have to discover with the materials you have, like what works best for you and everything like that. So that being said, sometimes people like to glue their tabs on the outside. I really prefer to glue them on the inside, just because I think that it actually makes the bond a little bit stronger. But also, I think that aesthetically, it just looks a lot better just to have a nice clean angle and not to have a bunch of tabs on the outside. It just, I mean, when you have tons of boxes or trays stacked up in the collection storage, it looks really good when they're on the inside. So I also cut like a little tab out like that, and that's just so when you're gluing it, you can kind of adjust it so that the top is plainer. It's just an aesthetic thing. But so you just put a little bit of glue. Okay. Yeah, good question. So this is a 3M glue, and this is a 3M gun. It's called a Polygun TC. This version takes these little glues, but I actually like to use the ones that are a lot longer. I have links to where you can get these on Amazon. This glue has been tested using ADI tests, and it's been determined to be okay to use in museum collections as long as it's not in direct contact with the object. So I wouldn't glue your object to the tray or anything like that. 3M also makes an archival glue, although the smell when you burn it is like horrible. So I don't use the archival glue, and this one has been ADI tested, so it's fine. And but I don't know about craft glue guns that you like just get at Joann's or something. I'm not sure if that glue's been tested, so I wouldn't use it unless you find out.
And is it the same kind of glue that you would use on glue board versus like Coroplast and Ethafoam and stuff like that?
Yeah, so there's the high melt and the low melt glue. The high melt glue is good for all these purposes. Low melt dries a little slower, I think, and that's better when you're working with like crates and wood and things like that. Okay, so we have our pallet now. We want to make our wedge. And the way I make wedges is to use Ethafoam and Volara. So Ethafoam, it's just a common term for polyethylene foam plank. And Volara is another type of polyethylene foam. They're both the same material, just manufactured differently. And there's different densities of polyethylene foam. So you can see this one's kind of squishy, but this one's like very hard. It's better to use the harder versions. So actually this one is a little too squishy for my liking. The reason is that when you put glue on it, it kind of it melts this very fast. But also the more squishy it is, that means the more like gas and additives have been added to it during production. So these ones sometimes actually don't pass ADI tests. The philosophy of the wedge. I have a bunch of wedges here. So here are some examples of wedges, and basically what it is, it's just little pieces of Ethafoam cut out. And even though it's okay for Ethafoam to have direct contact with your object, it is kind of abrasive. So it's always a really great idea, if you can, to line it with Volara, because Volara is like really nice and smooth. And it's also kind of like, we always feel kind of reluctant to touch our object. So you might want to just kind of like stick the wedge on the pallet and not quite touch your object directly, make it a little bit loose. But actually, the object's much safer if we make it totally immobile. So we want to make contact with our object and keep it safe. That being said, though, another goal making a storage mount is to make contact as little as possible with our object. And so what we do is we take our object, and we kind of look at it, and we have to assess, okay, where are the safest places on this object for me to put wedges on? So we don't want to stick a wedge right where there's like a break or a crack in her object, right? And so we're going to put them in the least number of places possible to make sure that it can't move at all, but so that it's safe. But also, bringing back that thing about just having an intuitive storage mount where someone just knows exactly how to pick it up without any notes, we look at our object and say, okay, what are the best places to pick up this object? And then you, as the storage mount maker, place your wedges around that spot. And that way, this person doesn't even know that you meant to do it, but when they go, their hands are going to go straight to where you want their hands to go because of where you put your wedges. So it's just things to be thinking about when you do that. So to make the wedge, if you can use a glue gun to attach Volara to Ethafoam, but what's even greater is to use a hot air gun tool. And because a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually fuse Volara to Ethafoam. And that makes a much smoother, complete bond that doesn't involve using glue at all. And it's really simple. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Bless you. So that's another heat gun besides this one. So you turn it on and you start heating up your Ethafoam. And the minute you see the surface of your Ethafoam start kind of getting a little bit sparkly or a little bit glossy, that's when you know it's starting to melt, and you can press your Ethafoam down. And then you just keep going and sticking it on. And it's kind of instinctual that as you melt the Ethafoam, you want to kind of press down the Volara, but we actually want to avoid that because if you press it down when the Ethafoam's still hot, we're going to make a handprint in there. So the ideal thing is to actually, as you heat it, just kind of roll the Volara on there. So I'm going to show you. So I'm going to start to melt it. Just to get it started. Nope. Then you just go back and forth. And you can see it's really nicely on there, yeah. I know, it's awesome. And then all you do is you turn your plank over and you trim down the edges. I did this like super crooked. And then you have this nice, beautiful foam plank with Volara on top that's all ready to start cutting up into wedges. So, you just cut a piece off. You can cut it at angles. Look, that's like just ready, perfect, ready to be wedged right into an object. So that's just turning it over, trimming it off, and that's the finished plank. You can use a ruler to just cut strips. And so this is good, like all the mounting I did, I was just producing stuff really, really fast. So we just made tons and tons of planks like this and had them all in one basket. So you just go over there, pick it up, ready to go for making mounts. Here's an example of the 10 Commandments from the movie, wedged into a tray. Here's this little guy with a bunch of different little shaped wedges. And you can also heat seal Volara to Volara. So this is the thin Volara, but Volara also comes in a 1/4 inch size. And Volara also comes in like a 1/2 inch and a 1 inch size too. But those ones are super expensive and they're actually kind of hard to cut. So you can actually save a lot of money and make your carving a lot easier by buying the 1/4 inch Volara and then just heat welding 2 pieces of that together to make a 1/2 inch piece of Volara. And then you get some really nice 1/2 inch Volara wedges. And that just works exactly the same way. I actually did a little bit of this already, but It takes a little bit longer to melt, but you can just do it the same way. Then once you're done, well, you might be thinking like, okay, what can this wedge in, right? It's so it's so thin, but this is really good for like jewelry, little tiny archaeological fragments, because what you can do is once you have your pieces cut, you can cut tiny little strips of it, like this, but a lot neater. And then you can actually bend them around your object, like in a circle, and glue them down onto the pallet that way. So that actually saves you money, because then you don't actually have to like put a whole entire piece of Volara down, cut out the shape of your object to insert your object. You can just bend the Volara around your object, and then you have all that space saved. So here's some examples, some horse shackles. And here's some metals where, in this one, I actually traced the shape with a pencil in Volara, cut it out using a scalpel, and then just put it in there. I really love this method for like necklaces and stuff, because that's how like a fancy necklace case comes anyway, where you just put the necklace around shape. So I really like just cutting out the shape. Yeah. Yeah, so what I'm doing is, let's say I have a circular like metal bracelet or something. I'm just tracing the shape on a piece of Volara, cutting the shape out. Say that's the shape of it. Yeah, cut the shape off, and then I glue a piece of Volara into my tray or on my pallet, and then I glue this over that piece of Volara, and then you can just stick your object right inside there. That's what I do. Do you put foam in the middle as well to kind of, if it's like a chain or pin or something? Yeah, and then if it's a necklace, I'll just take this little piece, make it a little bit smaller around the circumference, and then just glue it right inside. And then you just put your necklace or a ring, or well, rings you don't need one on the inside, but here's some shackles where I just cut a bunch of circles out of Volara and stuck them in the pallet. They were like in a box, just banging against each other, and corrosion was flying everywhere. So with those Volara wedges, it kept them all separated. All right, so can move on to boxes. And in this presentation, I'm really just going to go over the 2-part and the 3-part box, because honestly, I hardly ever use anything fancier than that. So there are like clamshell boxes, or there are window boxes that open like door in front. And I do have slides with those too, and handouts, so if you want like diagrams for how to make those boxes, I can send them, but I hardly ever use them. So I'm just going to review these 2 types today. So the 2-part box is basically the same way that we make a tray, except we make the tray walls higher. And the lid is basically a tray, but just maybe with like 3/8 inch, added to each side. So you make it a little bit bigger so it can fit on top of the box. I usually don't use 2-part boxes for anything higher than like, 10 inches maybe. Because once an object gets high enough, it gets kind of awkward to stick your hands inside. Then you start needing to make your boxes a lot bigger so you can get your hands inside. So that's when I moved to the 3-part box. 3-part boxes are my favorite. They're great. Here's a example of one. This is just like maybe, like for instance, take this World War II helmet, and it was inside of this box that's like, a pre-ordered archival box from Gaylord, which are great boxes. But the problem is that this helmet was at the bottom, and so it was super awkward to try to get my hands in to lift it out. And not only that, but I didn't know what I was touching underneath. And actually, it was really lucky, but it turns out that when I actually got this helmet out, there was a little painting on the helmet. The paint was like really powdery, and if I had touched it with my glove, then it would have I could have damaged the painting. So visibility is really key. And so I took this out and ended up making a 3-part box for it. And a 3-part box is really simple, because all you're doing are making two trays basically. One acts as the base, one acts as the lid. They're the exact same size. So you just make two identical trays, and then you add up all the sides of your tray plus 2 inches for a tab. So you get this long piece of either, you can use coroplast like here, or you can use blue board. And you have this long piece, and you just bend it where your creases are, and then glue the tab like you can see here. And then, so your object goes in on its pallet, and then the walls just fit right inside, and you put your lid on. And this is great, because then, you can have actually really tall objects mounted in 3-part boxes, and they're so safe to pick up because all someone has to do is remove the walls, and then they only have 2 inches that they have to take an object out of. It's a really great box. The only thing with these is that if someone picks them up from the side, sometimes they can fall apart. So it's important, if someone's going to be handling them, to strap them. So here's the sides, and then like here, I use just a belt strap you got from like Amazon, but actually my preference is just to use stretch wrap around it. And if you have stretch wrap in your museum storage all the time, it's really easy just to cut through stretch wrap and then re-stretch something. And actually the cool thing about this too is that if your pallet fits like perfectly into your tray, then when you put in the sides, they sit on top of your pallet. So that actually keeps your pallet down so it can't jump at all. So here's a little like alien head mask in a 3-part box and strapped. And so let's say you can't make a 3-part box, or let's say your collection already has a bunch of pre-ordered boxes from Gaylord. To get around that, you can do something called a saddle, I call a saddle mount. And basically what it is you're just making this U shape. And so it just goes right into the bottom of your box, and the sides come all the way to the top. And you can even cut out little handles. And so you can just pull that saddle mount that your pallet's on right out of the box, and you don't have to worry about putting your hands inside. And just a really quick note, all these boxes were made of blue board so far, but you can make more heavy-duty boxes using the exact same technique with coroplast. The way you do that, though, to bend it across the grain, is to just make a little score with your knife, and then you use the heat gun along that score that you made, and it'll bend right away. Even the 10mm coroplast will bend with heat. Okay, so I'm going to start with pottery mounts. So I'm just going to go through from start to finish how I do a pot. And first, of course, we measure the diameter. And then today I just brought this little guy from home. So we measure the diameter of our pot, add 1/2 inch to each side, and that's how we get the dimensions of our pallet. So then we have our pallet, and we cut off the tabs to make it easier to handle. That. And we make our tray that's just like 2 inches on each side, this dimension plus 2 inches on each side. So it fits right in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just make a little circle out of Velara that's just slightly a little bit smaller than the base of our ceramic. So you can, usually have a bunch of little jars or something around at different sizes. So I'm going to use this little thing that's about the right size. Just take a piece of Velara and you can cut it out with your scalpel. Scalpels are really great for cutting Velara, so I recommend ordering them if you don't have them. And then we're going to put a little bit of glue on it and stick it right in the center of our pallet, just like that. So that gives, so again, even though it's okay for objects to make direct contact with this blue board because it's a long-lasting archival, this Velara just gives it a little more cushion, so It can receive vibrations a little bit better if it bumps or anything like that. And then we want to wedge it in. So this is probably the best thing of this entire workshop. This is a wedge that I use for ceramics I call the super wedge because it's awesome. So when we see a ceramic, our instinct is usually to like cut a wedge that's the exact shape of the ceramic side and stick it in. The problem with that is that that's really time consuming and it hardly ever fits perfectly. And so this wedge, you can see that it's kind of weird. It has this concave inverted center, and that's going to allow us to actually conform the shape of the wedge exactly to any shape of any ceramic. This concave surface is also really good because it means that our wedge is only making contact along these edges. So that's awesome too because it's limiting the amount of contact we have with the actual object. So I'm going to just go through the process of how we make it and how we use it. So the first thing we do is we start with a plank of ATALM. And you're going to cut this depending on the height of your ceramic, for instance. So we have this plank of ATALM. The first thing we're going to do, we take our knife and we just make an incision right down the center that's about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch deep. And then we turn it around and do it on the other side too. It's like a cooking show. And then we're going to cut along a diagonal. So from the edge of the ATALM to the bottom of that incision.
You make that look really easy, and I know it's
not. You'll get the hang of it. Yeah. You can also go like that and make it easier. When I was doing this for the Southwest, we actually had a machine with blades that we jigged up. We just ran it through and it created the cuts. So you have your piece that looks like this. And then we're going to attach some Volara to the edge. This is easier done with 2 people. And now we're going to heat seal our Volara to it. So we're just going to heat it and kind of push it down. So now our Volara is heat sealed to it, and now we can just turn it around and trim the edges off. And that's what it's going to look like on one of the sides. And then you just turn it around and you do the exact same thing on the other side. So, so here's one that's I made yesterday a little bit. And so how we get our wedge now is we're just going to cut a chunk off, so just a square. And with one square, we get 2 wedges because we're just going to cut it right across the diagonal like that. So now we have 2 wedges. So the way we get it, so you might think like, okay, so that really doesn't conform to the surface, right? So the way we get it to conform to the surface, we're going to make an incision right behind the Volara, not through the Volara, but just through the ATALM, down the back. So we have this incision right there. We put it in, and then we always have like spare ATALM lying around, just scrap ATALM. I'm just going to use this piece. So we just use that scrap ATALM, to just make little triangles. So here are just some like little scrap triangles, and we just insert them into that incision that we made until it conforms perfectly with the surface of the ceramic. So I don't know, can everyone see that a bit? And then once we have that, all we have to do is just stick a little bit of glue in there. I actually like to glue them down first and then glue the wedges in. Ran out of glue. But you see the idea, right? Okay, so once it's glued in there, and actually I'm going to use this one. So I made this one, so pretty funky, right? But so once all your wedges are glued in there, you can see the ceramics just fits right in. You just make it, you just trim them. You just trim off the side. Glued that one too much. Put too much glue. And you have a nice and neat mount. And if the wedges are like sticking out of the sides too, that's no problem because you can even trim them down the sides and make your wedges even narrower, you know, and that's really good for like really tiny small ceramics or things like that. They're all glued though. So fits right in and you have a really nice, neat mount that you can use. That's right.
What is your invention?
Huh? No, okay, so I learned this from Ashley McGrew and Thomas Rosenquist at the Southwest Museum of the American Indian. And they taught me, I think they developed it because we rehoused the entire collection of about 10,000 ceramics using this method. Yeah. So it's all nice. And you can see that it's only making contact on those two edges. Really nice, so we're not making too much contact. And then you can also trim the wedges. You can make them really narrow. You can make them steeper. Also, you can use really big planks of ethafoam. You can do the exact same method on a huge piece of ethafoam and mount a huge pot. And it works just as well. It's so sturdy. So you can see here are the big wedges, and here are these huge pots mounted that same way. This piece is about 2 feet tall and really heavy, and it was perfectly stable. You can even cut off the tips like this and wedge it in, like if you have an object, you know, that's not like a typical ceramic shape, like this little owl, so it can still be lifted out. And I like to use it even when I can for other objects. Like for this object, I could have used a regular wedge with just a flat side, but I like using this one because it limits the amount of contact the wedge has with the object. And you can line these with other materials. So this is a material called Tyvek. It's a spun-bonded polyolefin fiber, and it's really nice and soft. So sometimes I will make a typical ceramic mount for a basket, but since the baskets are kind of, you know, they can snag on things, what I'll do is I'll just cut a piece of Tyvek in a strip, and then I'll make a little insertion with a razor blade down the sides, and then I'll just put that little piece of Tyvek over that strip and tuck it into those incisions that I just made. And then you have a really nice, smooth surface that you can use for even baskets. This is kind of weird, but for this one, I actually padded out. I put some padding on the surface and then put this really cool material. Shoot, do I have it? Oh man, it's not open yet. I have to open it. This really cool material called Teflon or relic wrap. You get it from Gaylord. And it's the same thing as plumber's tape, basically. It's also what our dental floss is made out of. And it's like polytetrafluoroethylene. So I'm going to pass this around. But this is a really nice, non-abrasive material. It's super soft, and it can be stretched in one direction. So this is good for, really great for covering things. So, and also I forgot to mention, I brought some baggies. So if anyone wants to come out and just take some samples of whatever I have up here to take with you, you can. Can pass that around. Oh, and then also, you don't only have to make the incision down, you don't only have to make the incision down the edge. Like, what if instead of making the incision at the top, you make the incision just right in the center? And then you just fill the edges with other triangles, but then just right in the center. Then you're going to get a bulge right in the center. So you can use this method for like weird shapes. Like this was the same wedge that I just made right now, but I just made the incision right there in the middle and stuffed it with triangles and then trimmed it. And now I have this really cool curvy shape. So this concave in center really allows you to just make any shape you want to. It's great. Okay, so arrows. It's getting messy up here. This is a material called tri-rod. It's just ethafoam, the same stuff as this. And so you can actually just, if you have an ethafoam plank, you can just cut it into triangles. You don't need to actually order this. If you can get, yeah, I was wondering, I think that it's actually discontinued, which kind of sucks.
Which is depressing.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was awesome while it lasted. But you can just cut a triangle out of ethafoam plank. How I learned to do this was to make a little incision, a triangle right into your other triangle. You cut it along the bottom and pull that out. And this is great for arrows because you can, when you mount this on a pallet and it's sturdy, all you have to do is pull apart that triangle a little bit, stick the arrow in, and then it closes up again. And so not only can the arrow not move side to side, but it can't jump up out of the pallet either. And this is just plumber's tape or Teflon. It's the same stuff as that. And it's really nice if you have it just to stick that in there, just like you see here, because it's that nice, soft surface to put in between the ethafoam and your arrow.
Did you say that was off-the-shelf plumber's tape?
Yeah, it's called polyfluorotetraethylene.
Okay.
It's plumber's tape, or Teflon is one of the brands. This is just from Uline.
And
It's good, yeah.
they're okay.
Yeah, it's audio tested, yeah.
So you would just like glue one end underneath?
Yeah, you could just like glue it on the side, or you could make a little incision with a scalpel and then tuck it in each one if you wanted to. But the arrow can usually keep it in place. Do you guys want to pass this around too, if you want to? And so, okay, this is a method to use for a hat or a headdress. I use ethafoam. It's really hard and time-consuming to carve an actual head. So this is just a really simple way to do it, where basically you're just carving like a general form of a head, or just something like this with ethafoam, and then you're surrounding it. Oh, I didn't bring it with me. Shoot, I'm sorry. With polyester batting. So, okay. This is 100% polyester batting that you would get on a roll. However, 100% polyester batting also comes loose. So it comes in a bag. It's called fiber fill, and you can just pull it out and stretch it. And that stuff is great because you can just layer it onto an ethafoam form, and you get a really nice smooth surface. Whereas this is a little harder because you get, weird shapes and stuff. So this is how you do it. This is a couple that are in finished state. So you make that ethafoam form, and then what you do is you cut an incision in the bottom in the ethafoam with your scalpel. So I'm going to deconstruct this one. So you have your ethafoam form that I carved, just really simple, easy, took like 2 seconds. Oh, here's the loose polyester fiber fill that I just put all around it. I made that incision in the bottom, and then I just pulled my material over and stuck it inside. Last night when I was making this, I didn't have that relic wrap, but that's what I prefer to use. I love stretching that relic wrap around, and it makes it so smooth. You can also use muslin, which is just, like nice muslin fabric. You may prefer to use something like this if it's for exhibit, for instance. So there you are stuffing in that Teflon. And you can see it's squishy, so it kind of squishes. You squish it when you put the hat on, and then once it's on, it kind of expands a little bit and it stays in place. But it's important we don't want to overstuff anything, so you want just the right amount so that you're not putting any stress on the object, but it's just enough to fill the center and just keep it sturdy. So here are some hats mounted on those. And you can also, you mount it on a pallet. You can also make it reversible from the pallet, like make a little puzzle piece. So this hat can actually go straight from its storage mount pallet onto exhibit. Here's one of Muhammad Ali's headgear that's really hardened and squashed from being stored badly. So I just made that plank. And just a note, I'm sorry I don't have any pictures of the headdress mounts I've made, but this is the way I would do it. I would make a form like that, but make it tall, like this tall. And that way the headdress sits on the top of that head mount, and everything that's behind it can just flow down onto the big pallet that you made on that. Here's another movie prop. And so I'm out of time right now. Again, this is going to be on the video. So this is just a solution for tall objects. The idea is that instead of wedging something in at the bottom on a pallet, with something like this, you can stick your wedges anywhere. You can have a wedge coming from the back. You can glue a wedge to the side that comes down and wedges your object in from the side, because what if your object's like a little Kachina doll that's like this, You might need a wedge to come in right there and there on the bottom. And then what you do is you just, so there's some wedges. That one was really simple. You can also wedge it in at the base. Here's some of that plumber's tape or Teflon tape. There's also twill tape. You make the holes wherever you need to and just tie it wherever it's going to be safely possible with a bow on the back. And so this is the only place where I use bows or ties. And you can see that it's really stable. And you can make it out of coroplast too. Here's another little item. So thank you so much.